Good morning. My name is Carl Sferraza Anthony. I'm an author and historian of some 12, 13 books on the First Ladies, both collective biographies and individual ones. And my first two books were sort of a biography, if you will, on the role of First Lady over a 200-year period from 1789 to 1989. And today's panel, we are going to, of course, be putting our emphasis on, because there's a lot of material just to cover in talking about Mrs. Nixon. So I will open with a very brief overview of that role of First Lady and bringing us up to 1969 when Pat Nixon becomes a First Lady. And the way at the time that role was perceived, it had been less than 10 years that Jackie Kennedy had done her famous White House tour of her restoration work, the refurbishing along historical lines of the White House, and created the White House Historical Association. She had many other projects and interests, but that was what she became most identified with, followed by Lady Bird Johnson, who first undertook a somewhat similar effort in terms of the exterior, meaning the land and the environment, first of Washington, D.C., and then of the nation. So there was a vague expectation that Pat Nixon would take on one quote-unquote project, but in looking at the overall role of First Lady, we see that from the beginning it was one fraught with symbolism in everything they said and did, even within the traditional confines of the 19th century and the early 20th century, with the expectations of women's roles in American society. We see that with First Ladies, it could be a little bit different. Dolly Madison, for example, used entertaining to essentially integrate not only men and women at social events, but members of her husband's party and the opposition, trying to forge a spirit of bipartisanship. Lucy Hayes was famously nicknamed Lemonade Lucy for not permitting the serving of any alcohol in the White House, and there were sort of cartoons and jokes, but in fact it was a political concession to the Prohibition Party that her husband had made in thanks for their support of his nomination and election. As one gets into the 20th century, we see First Ladies taking their so-called interests a step further into legislation. Nellie Taft had an interest in civic issues. She was a member of the National Civic Foundation, National Civil Society, and she took a great interest in the improvement of Washington, D.C., but also in the improvement of the health and safety of federal workers. And she was behind a presidential proclamation in 1912 that ensured the health and safety measures of federal workers, and she was credited publicly for that. Florence Harding was very active in caring for and seeing to the needs of and visiting the hospitals, the federal hospitals where veterans from the First World War were being treated. But it was really like an iceberg, because underneath the water, she was involved in the appointment of the first director of the Veterans Bureau. So you saw this role of First Lady as the media is evolving, with first illustrations, and then photography, and then newsreels, and then sound. Increasingly, the role of First Ladies' public acts becoming politicized. Bess Truman, who many think of as the ultimate in non-political first ladies, was actually behind the scenes encouraging the appointment of women in the administration, and particularly women scientists. She was also advising the presidents on the creation of Aramco, the Arabian-American oil company. Mamie Eisenhower, thought of as the quintessential hostess of the 1950s, used that hostess role to make a statement on civil rights and against Senator Joseph McCarthy. And even Jackie Kennedy was involved in terms of her interest in the arts. When asked on her TV tour if she saw a government role, she said, "That's so complicated, I just think everything in the White House should be the best," but in fact was behind the creation of what eventually became the National Endowment of the Arts and Humanities. She also took a great interest in the troubling and growing conflict in Vietnam. Today, we have four individuals who bring with them special expertise and love and appreciation for the real Pat Nixon and the contributions that she made. I will add that at the end of this panel, we will be showing a spectacular film about Pat Nixon and all that she did as First Lady. So please stick around for that. I'd like to introduce immediately to my right Sarah Fling, who is an historian at the White House Historical Association, Maureen Nunn, who's a member of the Richard Nixon Foundation Board of Directors and a longtime friend of the Nixon family. Her mother, Helen Drown, was the best friend of Mrs. Nixon for many, many decades. The two women were extremely close. Mary Brennan is the Dean of College of Liberal Arts at Texas State University and the author of Pat Nixon, Embattled First Lady. And on Zoom, we'll be hearing from Bob Bostock, who worked with President Nixon during the last 5 years of his life and wrote the original panels, the gallery panels for the first Nixon Library. He continued to curate multiple exhibits here, including the one in 2012 marking the centennial of Pat Nixon's life. Now, we have talked ahead of time about dividing up some of the areas where Mrs. Nixon had her greatest impact. And while each individual will give focus to that, we're going to also open it up because we all know a lot about Mrs. Nixon, and if anything is left out or needs mentioning, we'll all fill in. I will ask Sarah first, as a historian at the White House Historical Association, as well as Bob Bostock, to talk about the most immediately public visual impact of Pat Nixon, and that was her work with the White House Historical Association.
Yes, absolutely. And it's very difficult to encompass the many White House legacies of Mrs. Nixon in a short time, but I'll do my best, and I know that Bob will supplement this as well. Of course, one of the most obvious impacts that Mrs. Nixon has on the White House are her acquisition efforts. And if you walk through the White House today, the White House that you see is largely a testament to her work with White House curator Clem Conger. And Bob will talk a little bit more about those acquisition efforts, but this is a project that we're really proud of course, at the White House Historical Association in carrying forward a legacy not just of Mrs. Kennedy, who made these efforts very public, but also first ladies throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries who realized the importance of preservation. People like Caroline Harrison, for example, Lou Hoover, and others who really wanted to augment the history of the White House. But one of my personal favorite things about Mrs. Nixon's work in terms of the White House collection is that she inherently understood that museum work doesn't end with a collection. And I think so many of us who work in the museum and archival field understand this, that you can have a wonderful, fantastic, well-done collection of objects and furnishings, but none of it matters if you don't get people through the door to experience them. And while certainly many White House tourists had come through the years, Mrs. Nixon understood that there were many barriers to entry for different groups on White House tours, and she worked throughout her time there to remove many of these barriers. So one great example of this is wheelchair accessibility at the White House. And we're talking about decades before the Americans with Disabilities Act that Mrs. Nixon realizes something should be done here. And previously, in terms of White House accessibility, really we only see Franklin Delano Roosevelt make some changes to the White House because of his own wheelchair use. He adds ramps, especially to the West Wing, and elevators in areas that he uses to get from the residence downstairs. But these aren't in areas where a tourist would come to see the White House. So those are early things that we see happen at the White House that are later carried forward to actually include those that are visiting the people's house. And that's all thanks to Mrs. Nixon. Another barrier that she removes are for blind and deaf and hard of hearing visitors at the White House, and realizing that, again, if you can't understand, see, or hear what's happening on a tour, you're not getting the full experience or the magic of the White House collection, the interiors in the house. So she works with the White House guides and creates interpretation that makes it more accessible for deaf, hard of hearing, and blind visitors. She even has special tours of the White House where blind visitors can physically touch objects in the White House collection. That's really remarkable by modern standards, and it initiates a new era of accessibility at the White House. And then the final one I want to touch on in terms of accessibility to actually see the people's house is multilingual visitors, and that many visitors to the White House might not speak English as their first language, and that adding multilingual interpretation to come and learn more about the White House really brings in an entirely new demographic of people to understand the history of the executive mansion. So we see these several different ways that she brings access to the people's house, and it's really remarkable because the White House belongs to the American people, as Jackie Kennedy always said. And so you need to bring as many people with as many abilities, languages through the door as you can. And on that same level of tours, another thing that I want to add in terms of Mrs. Nixon's longevity and legacy that we still see at the White House today, and 'tis the season for White House garden tours, which we will see very soon. And I think this is a really great legacy of Mrs. Nixon. The White House garden tours, as we know them today, begin with her in 1973. And this is a chance for members of the public to actually come learn about the history of the grounds. They had been able to come before for something like an egg roll and see the White House gardens and grounds, but maybe not learn so much about why these things matter, why it matters to preserve this history. And at the very first White House spring garden tour that Mrs. Nixon hosts, she's got White House gardeners on hand where you can ask them questions about what their daily work is like or what that flower or plant is, as well as historical resources to learn more. And to bring this to the present, I think it's actually a really interesting piece of her legacy, because during the Nixon era, if you wanted to go on a tour of the White House, you could line up very early in the morning, wait all day, hope that you could get in. Of course, that's no longer the case, right? It's very difficult to just decide that you want to go to the White House. You've got to call your congressman. You've got to put in a request very early. But the spring and fall garden tours are still a way that people can decide day of that they want to get up close and personal to the White House. And this is especially relevant for Washingtonians to actually get a chance to go see the gardens and have an opportunity without putting in weeks and months of requests and work on the back end to actually go see the people's house. So this is something that, of course, she couldn't have known when she first instituted the garden tours, that they would remain one of the most accessible ways for the public to see the White House, but now we see that as one of her major legacies. And one last thing I'll mention before I really want to pop over to Bob to talk about the collection itself is something that we really take for granted now, and it's the illumination of the White House at night. In 1970, Mrs. Nixon flips the switch to have the White House lit after dark, which seems very crazy now that that wasn't happening. They even use funds that are left over from Nixon inaugural activities to do so. But now this is a great legacy that we see from the Nixon era, that even if a tourist gets in on a red-eye flight and it's it's the middle of the night and they want to walk past and see the people's house, they can do so. And that's all thanks to Pat Nixon.
I would also, if you would want to mention the fact that, you know, as a person who had worked her whole life, sensitive to the time constraints of people, particularly federal workers who work 9 to 5, that during the holiday season, she opened at night the White House.
Yes, so during the holiday season, we see the White House candlelight tours become another one of these Nixon-era institutions that she introduces. And it's a great example, again, of understanding the needs of actual people. And this is a thread I know we're going to talk about over and over and over on this panel, is that Mrs. Nixon understood what people needed. She listened. She cared about people actually coming through the doors. So yeah, if you're working a 9 to 5 job, no, you can't wake up in the morning, stand in line in the heat or the cold all day and hope you can get into the White House. But if there's a candlelight holiday tour, you might just have the chance to go in after you've worked a long day and enjoy the festivities with your family. So it's just one of those other examples of her really tuning into how do we get more people to experience the White House as the people's house.
Are the candlelight tours still held?
They are not. From my understanding, the candlelight tours actually ended around the 9/11 era for security purposes.
Yeah, so many security. Bob, I'm hoping you might be able to fill us in a little bit more on the actual process of the collection and creating that large legacy she did.
Sure, I'm happy to. Sarah's excellent explanation of how important it was to Mrs. Nixon that people be able to see the house reminded me of a story that she would tell that in 1947, when she and the future president had just arrived in Washington, he is the newly elected representative from the 12th District of California. They received an invitation to go to a reception to the Truman White House. And the new representative, young Dick Nixon, was not too keen on going. He had a very busy workload. And Mrs. Nixon said to him, "Come on, Dick, we need to go. We may never get back to that house again." So I think she retained for her entire life the kind of the wonder and awe that people would have as in being able to see the White House. But the collections are just amazing, the acquisitions that she did. She acquired more than 600 pieces of furniture and art and other furnishings for the White House collection. That's more than any first lady before or since. And how it all got started is a pretty interesting story. She and the president had been over to the diplomatic reception rooms of the State Department, where Clem Conger was the curator. And these rooms are filled with one of the finest collections of 18th century American furniture and art that exist anywhere in the country. And they talked, the Nixons talked and said, you know, we ought to get Clem Conger over here to help us with our collection because it's still, despite the efforts that Mrs. Kennedy made, there were still a lot of things that were not properly represented and a true American sense to the look of the mansion. So she worked with Clem Conger and others to acquire pieces. She was very, very effective at persuading people to lend and then sometimes permanently lend, i.e. give pieces to the White House. She was most proud of being able to acquire for the White House collection from the family of John and John Quincy Adams, portraits of President John Quincy Adams and his wife Louisa for the collection. They had a very nice event unveiling that, where I think something like 75 of the Adams descendants were at the White House for that event. Every corner of the White House really reflects, I think, Mrs. Nixon's commitment to increasing the collection and to really make certain that the house reflected the earliest days of the Republic, which is when it was built. Back in 2011, Carl was good enough to mention that I had curated Mrs. Nixon's centennial exhibit. Several of us from the foundation went to the White House to meet with some folks there about how we might involve them in the centennial celebrations of Mrs. Nixon's birth, which would happen in 2012. And we met with the curator of the White House, Bill Ullman. And I remember saying to him, we would really like to borrow a couple of pieces to exhibit out at the library in California. I said, you know, Mrs. Nixon acquired more than 400 pieces. I'm sure there's something in the White House warehouse that you could send out there that would not be missed in the house. And he quickly replied, that everything she collected was of such quality and such historic importance that none of it is in the White House. And they're going to have to figure out how they can take a couple of things that are in the mansion at that point and send them out to California. And they did. They sent us a Duncan Fife chair that was in the green room and a beautiful 19th century landscape by William Innes that was called Rainbow in the Berkshire Hills. And we were able to display those two pieces as part of Mrs. Nixon's centennial exhibit back in 2012. So the reach and the effect of what she was able to accomplish, both in terms of how the rooms are decorated as well, continues on to this day. She said at the time when they opened the Blue Room that had been recently redone, someone asked, how long do you hope this lasts? And she said, oh, I'd be happy if it lasts 10 years. Well, in fact, the imprint she has put on the mansion has lasted 50 plus years and will endure, I'm sure, for quite a while. I just want to read a real quick quote from William Seal, probably the best White House historian and certainly a major impact on the White House Historical Association. He wrote the definitive 2-volume history of the White House. Fascinating read if you ever get a chance. But he wrote that the Nixon era was the greatest single period of collecting in White House history. The great collection of White House Americana today is the long shadow of Mrs. Nixon. The impulse, the idea, and the energy were hers. And I don't think anyone captured more succinctly and persuasively the impact that Mrs. Nixon made on the White House collection and just on how it looks overall. And the fact that all of the things she did to enable more and more people to come through the house and enjoy it, particularly in the era when it was much easier to get into the White House, is something that literally millions of people have seen. They may not know that it was Mrs. Nixon who acquired all these things and made it possible for people with disabilities and others to come through and enjoy the house. But she really left an enduring mark on the executive mansion that people appreciate and really enjoy right up until the present time, and I'm sure will for many years.
I know that along with the furniture, she was, as you mentioned, the Adams portraits. She was also responsible for the, I think, permanent loan is what they called it, of a portrait of Dolly Madison, bringing that to public display for the first time in the White House, and was also there to oversee this rather sensitive process of bringing the portraits of the late President Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, and by that time Onassis, and arranging for the former First Lady and her 2 children to come back to the White House. Mrs. Nixon had known as a Senate and then vice presidential wife the elderly Mrs. Woodrow Wilson, Edith Wilson, and I know she first was very excited before she married President Nixon at a conference on social services in New York at the Waldorf Astoria, met Mrs. Roosevelt. And then, of course, was very close to Mamie Eisenhower and filled in for Mrs. Eisenhower during those 8 years of the Eisenhower presidency. So she was very sensitive to the role of First Lady. But I'm wondering, Bob, if you could tell us just a little bit about the visit back and how she very sensitively helped to arrange for the visit of Mrs. Onassis and her kids.
Sure. Mrs. Kennedy, when she left the White House after President Kennedy's assassination, had not returned to the House at all, despite many invitations from President Johnson to do so. But when the portraits of the president and Mrs. Kennedy were ready to be hung in the White House, normally there'd be a ceremony where the family could come and see the official reception and hanging of these portraits. But Mrs. Kennedy, then Mrs. Onassis, did not want to come back. So Mrs. Nixon said, why don't you bring your 2 children, just the 3 of you. We'll have a private event. We'd love to have you here for dinner. The girls can show your children, the Nixon daughters, the girls, as everybody called them back then, can show the kids around, and you get to see the portraits privately. So Mrs. Onassis agreed to that. The president sent a government plane up to New York to bring them down to the White House. They came in completely without anybody knowing. Helen Thomas had managed to find out, and they promised to get, she was the reporter for the UPI. They made a deal with Mrs. Thomas that if she would just not print the story till after the visit was over, they'd give her the exclusive. So Mrs. Onassis and Caroline and John Kennedy came. They were both teenagers at that point. They had dinner at the White House. The president took them down to the Oval Office so they could see where their father had worked. It was just a really special kind of family day. And at the end, after the visit was over and the Kennedys, Mrs. Onassis and her children went back to New York, Mrs. Onassis wrote the most beautiful letter to the president, Mrs. Nixon, that concluded with a phrase that was just very, very touching. She said, "A day that I have long dreaded has become one of the most precious I have spent with my children." And that was the only time Jackie Kennedy returned to the White House from the time she left in December 1963 and until she passed many years later. And I think that that event is not just important from a standpoint of the history of the White House, but here were two men who had run against each other in 1960, had known each other for a long time from their service in the House. They came to the House together in the 1946 election. They were in the Senate when Vice President Nixon was president of the Senate, and had that very tough and bitter campaign in 1960. But when families are in the White House, I think that they find that sharing that experience transcends politics. And I remember we had asked Caroline Kennedy to do a little video explaining that visit. And she said pretty much that at the end. She said, having lived in the White House, no matter what party you're in, that transcends anything to do with politics, and it's more about patriotism and tradition and love of country. And I think that visit really encapsulates something that I think perhaps isn't as prevalent today, but wouldn't be a bad thing to go back to.
Thank you so much for that, Bob. And Maureen, I'd like to now turn to you and starting to address what was a very large and groundbreaking role that Pat Nixon undertook as an ambassador to foreign nations. Not an ambassador in any kind of a formal sense, but a goodwill ambassador and a representative of the president at a time when President Nixon was very involved in Middle East policy. The United States was involved in many South American countries and their governments. Of course, in what was then called the Soviet bloc, behind the Iron Curtain, going to not just the Soviet Union and China, but to many of the satellites of the Soviet Union. And to talk a little bit about why she undertook that role and the impact that she had.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Nixon Foundation and the archives for putting this together today. It's just been fantastic. So thank you very much. And I want to start by saying that I am the oldest living person who knew Pat Nixon for her entire life. I was born in 1942, so do the math. Pat was born in 1912. I want to go back just a bit, how this happened. My mother, Helene Drown, was teaching at Whittier High School. And Thelma, she had changed her name from Thelma to Pat in honor of her father, because she was born on the evening of St. Patrick's Day. So my mother and Pat met when they were teaching at Whittier High School, and they became longtime best friends. They even died in the same year. Kind of gruesome, but I mean, it just to show, to show their friendship. So I knew Pat Nixon and President Nixon from the time that I was born. And I'm a much better person for knowing both of them. They really were incredible people. I think the first memory I had, born in 1942, the first memory I had of them coming to our really very small house in Long Beach, I'm a very high active person, very, lots of energy, and I didn't like to go to bed. So, and I had this huge rabbit It was a stuffed rabbit, and can I call him Dick? So Dick and Pat would say, Maureen, go get your bunny, go get your bunny. So I'd run down the hall, get the bunny, bring it back. Oh, the bunny looks like it's really tired. Maybe I should go to bed. So here we are, running back and forth in the hallway and then falling asleep. But incredible stories. So to fast forward to 1953, when he was vice president under President Eisenhower, President Eisenhower came to Vice President Nixon and Pat and said, I want you to go on a 10-week trip to 19 countries, 43,000 miles. Well, Pat had never left her children. Tricia was 8 at the time. Julie was 6. And if you have ever traveled to the Far East, you know how far it is. And they were going to 19 different countries in different weather, different people, different leaders, different food, the whole 9 yards. I remember that Pat came out to go shopping with my mother, and maybe some of you remember there was a store called Buffum's here in in Southern California, and the buyer had selected some clothes for Pat that needed little or no ironing. And so she actually got those clothes. She splurged on one dress that was chiffon. And when they got to India, she had the wonderful person at the hotel. She only brought one person with her, by the way, on this entire 19-country trip. One person. Consider what today is. Anyway, this lovely lady was ironing the chiffon, and you know that chiffon grows. It stretches. So for the state dinner that night, and if you want the details on this too, Julie Nixon Eisenhower wrote a fantastic book called Pat Nixon, The Untold Story that you can get, and it's really a lot of details that I don't have time to share with you, but you can read about it. Anyway, the chiffon was on the floor, and so when she put this dress on, and she was very trim, as you know, for her entire life, so they zipped up her dress, and on the bottom was all of the chiffon that had swirled down. So she gathered up all the chiffon, she wrapped it around her body, she walked down into the state dinner, and she stood there absolutely motionless. And she wrote to my mother, she said, Helene, that was when the statue was born, because she absolutely could not move at all. They absolutely loved her. They loved her because, as she said, even though I can't speak your language, you will know if I have love in my heart for you. The way she briefed on this trip was she really wanted to meet the people. She did not want to go to teas and luncheons. She wanted to actually go to the schools, and she wanted to go to the hospitals and visit the people, be with them. So she learned language phonetically to be able to greet the people. And she also, one story is that, people say, well, how in the world did she deal with all the food that she'd never seen? So one story, when she was in Burma and they were at a dinner, she could not be the ugly American and say, ooh, what is this? I don't think I like it. I'm a vegan or whatever. I mean, you couldn't do that. So there was an unplucked a bird on the plate with the beady eyes. And so she touched it with her fork and it fell off the plate. But she very discreetly just lifted it right back on the fork again and just ate around it. And I know when she was, back in the day, back in 1954, when they went, there were no phones and no technology like we have now. So she would write my mother letters and say, what was happening on the trip. And those letters are in the archives. She also left her 2 daughters, 8 and 6 years old, so she wanted to actually keep in touch with them. Tell me about school. How are you doing? What's the weather like? Where did your friends go? What's a birthday party like? She was just loved so much, and people, that trip, that goodwill trip, actually was the goodwill ambassador. So it wasn't that only trip, but she went on further trips. She went to visit a leper colony in Panama. Can you imagine? She was the first woman to enter a combat zone in Vietnam and going into a helicopter. She visited the men in the hospital who had served in the war, in the Vietnam War. She went to them, she sat by their bedsides. She wanted to know the names of their parents or their loved ones here in the United States or wherever they were. And when she got back, she actually phoned their parents and said, I sat with your son and he's doing well. She, was the great ambassador for the, we all know the story about going to China, and she didn't want to go, to the teas and the luncheon, so she visited a place where they had acupuncture. She visited the zoo, the story of the pandas, and, she just was that kind of person. She was an enthusiastic person. She was a real person. The climates in those trips in the Far East were absolutely, sometimes were 100 degrees, and then you go back to cold weather. They went to, maybe some of you have been there, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, the Philippines, Vietnam, Afghanistan. So she took one suitcase for cold weather, and she took another suitcase for warm weather. 2 suitcases, 1 assistant, 19 countries, 43,000 miles in 10 weeks. And did she get sick? No. Did she get hungry? Yes. So they were able to take K-rations. They were able to take, when you go on the airplane, they give you snacks. So they actually took those things from the airplanes and they put them in their suitcases, because sometimes when they come back from a state dinner, 60 state dinners on that trip, they were really, really hungry. So they'd sit down and eat the saltines and eat the tomato soup. But I think one thing that is really just absolutely engraved in my mind is that when she said, even though you can't speak their language, they will know by the smiles and the hugs that you truly have love in your heart for all of them. And as mentioned on the panel too, she was voted the most admired woman in the world for 17 years, even when she left the White House. She was right up there with Mother Teresa, and she was just a great lady. So this symposium today is just really, really great.
I know one particular trip that she took that was really one kind of, wonderful, was the trip to Russia. Of course, the trip to China too, but people don't know that at that time, these were, despite television and stereotypes, ultimately life in a communist country was still a mystery. Life in the Soviet Union and in these other Soviet, communist satellite countries, and then in, as they used to call it, Red China, as a somewhat of a pejorative term, but meaning it was communist China. That television followed her, and for the first time, because of Mrs. Nixon, Americans were seeing and experiencing through her eyes and experiences what life in the Soviet Union and China was like.
Right, and I think too that the fact that when Eisenhower actually selected them to be on the trip, you probably already know there were 500 million communist Chinese that were vying for these countries. So, and no Westerners had been there to actually, they didn't know what even a Westerner was like. So to experience that and to really form a bond that was treasured forever, it really was. So yes.
I think also her trip to 3 African nations as First Lady were very important, not only in terms of international relations and what the Nixon administration wanted to achieve, but at a time when the United States was undergoing the first wave, the first generation of civil rights legislation, seeing people of color and seeing Mrs. Nixon be so personable and so involved and so welcomed so warmly, that had a second kind of impact that perhaps was not always immediately obvious. Can you recall any stories about her trips to Ghana or the Ivory Coast or?
Yeah, she went to the first inauguration of the woman president in the Ivory Coast. And I want to go back to just some things, because many people ask me, okay, how did she do this on these trips? How did she pack her clothes? And her secret for packing was, and maybe you know this, was to put tissue paper in between. So if I were going to pack this jacket, I would fold it, but then if I were going to pack the pants, I would put tissue paper between the jacket and the pants. And then I would take my shoes. I'm not going to do total visual here, but I would take my shoes. She would take her shoes, and she would actually put things that would fit into the shoes. So, you'll see those pictures of her in Ghana, too. She was actually, they draped her. Maybe some of you have been to Africa. People are so warm and welcoming. And so what they did was they actually wrapped her in the country's cloth, put a turban on her head, and they asked her to get up and dance. And she did. She just really loved the people so much. And there she, oh my gosh, thank you. Thank you for the incredible, video. And you can see, they had her get out and dance, and the children absolutely loved her. They would crawl in her lap. There's a really quick story about when she was on one of the trips. A little girl came up to her. Sarah, do you mind? And she came up to her. She was 6 years old, and she did not drop Mrs. Nixon's hand for the entire way, all the way into the gathering. She just held steadfast under her hand. So you can just see how much she was loved.
And I think one point to make with that, particularly with the foreign trips, is that there's legislation and there's policy and there are treaties and there are wars that deal with all of the political realities of international relations. But when you see somebody from an entirely different culture, treating others simply as human beings, whether they're men or women or children or older people, and that this was not some grand plan of Mrs. Nixon. It was simply relying on her human instincts.
Yes, she really, and I want to let Mary, please, get a chance to talk. I think the fact that you probably all know that her parents had both died by the time she was 17. So she really knew the ethic of hard work. But she always said to me, she said, Maureen, take your job seriously. Just don't take yourself seriously.
Interesting.
And so enjoy life, really have a good time. And she lived that. She truly, truly lived that. She worked hard, very, very hard. And but she had a wicked sense of humor. Her laughter would light up this room. Her Secret Service name was Starlight. Can you imagine? That's who she was.
Well, Mary, maybe you could talk to us a little bit and address what, for I think a lot of reporters at the time and the public, was sometimes appeared to be a little bit of an ill-defined, quote-unquote, project. And that was what she called volunteerism. I know that at one point that VISTA, which was the National Council encouraging volunteerism, that she was interested, I know, in the formation of that and went to several of their meetings. But she really functioned. And again, we should mention that the role of First Lady is still developing. So at this point, there's no chief of staff. Pat Nixon essentially served as her own chief of staff. And as her biographer, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that role, what she sought to accomplish and its impact.
Well, excuse me. Actually, I think that kind of ending with this is a good way, because so many of you have talked earlier today about how this time period was on the cusp of the difference between kind of the way women were in the past. And volunteerism fits into that very well. It's very feminine, it's very community-oriented, and so in that way, it was something that was politically very good, both for her husband and for the party, because they really kind of picked this out for her and kind of told her this was going to be her topic. But it fit in well with who she was, because she was someone who was this person, this woman of an earlier generation who said, you know what, I had to work hard. I always went out and worked. I've never worked. I always worked hard. And who didn't think in terms of somebody telling her, no, you couldn't, right? So in that way, it fits in with that part of it. But on the other hand, she's also someone who said, no, I'm not going to out meeting with these. I'm not going to go meet with dignitaries. If I'm going to go meet with volunteer associations, I'm going to go see where they're actually working. And so when they sent her out, the press would be waiting for her at the airport with, where are the bouquets of flowers? Where's the mayor? And that wasn't where she was, because she went to the facilities to see what people were doing. Now, as a topic, it was something that she did appreciate, because she was someone who said, I believe that a person is what a person does. Actually, she said, I believe it's what he does. All right? Because that's part of what she wants to do. It also, this also helped her to be able to escape what she called the big shots in Washington. It helped her to get out of the Washington, D.C. scene, to go out into the public, where she did have this amazing ability. And I think it goes back to what you said earlier, Linda. It has to do with her authenticity. At one of these volunteer groups, it was a young people's kind of group that she was seeing. And at the end of it, this young man came up and he said, can I give you a kiss on the cheek? And she said, sure. And he told a reporter afterwards, he said, I don't really like them. He said, I didn't expect this at all. He said, but she was like my grandmother. And that ability for her to just talk to people who did not agree with her, or who maybe didn't think about her as a person, that, I think, is something that comes through in all of these. And I have to say it for a minute, just going back to the Africa picture, and that picture of her in that blue turban is my favorite picture of her. Because the story that I read about it was that she was sitting, and they had brought her this fabric, and they expected that she would put the fabric under her chair. But instead, she stood up and was trying to put it on. And the women were amazed that she was trying to do this. And so they came up and started dressing her. And that, right there, that did more than any other kind of piece of legislation. And again, it was the authenticity of what she was trying to do. She was a woman who was very much caught in all of these different forces, and who always just tried to remain who she was. And in the process of doing that, I think, as we've seen today, she actually was able to make tremendous strides for women and for a lot of different people.
I think we might also talk a little, Mary, thank you for that, in the time we have left, a little bit about politics. And we always know President Nixon always credited his wife for really having very wise, practical advice, but that during the presidency, she was not really one of his primary advisors. And it's one reason why when she was asked about Watergate, she was telling the truth when she said she only knew what she had learned through the media, like most Americans did. Certainly during the Vietnam War, of course, the trip to Vietnam, but then when she went out on the road for some of the volunteer projects, she was confronted by particularly the student group, I can't remember what college, but I believe it was in Ohio, where it was a panel on volunteerism, but there were a lot of people wearing peace buttons and so forth. And so she toed the line, so to speak. She followed the administration policy. There was no conflict there. And then on the women's movement, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I know when we did the exhibit, Why They Wore It, about first ladies and how they used their clothing to sometimes make a political statement, one of the most interesting things is that Pat Nixon was the first lady to make public appearances in wearing pants. And that really sent an immediate visual message of her as sort of a moderate feminist of that era.
See, well, actually, in the article in which, because I think that article was in Ladies' Home Journal that she modeled the pantsuit, she also said, I'm not a feminist, because in my day, I never had anybody tell me I couldn't do anything. And I think that's the perfect encapsulation of this difference, right? On the one hand, she's still back here. She's a woman of her time. But she's also someone who says, okay, we got these opportunities. We've got to go out and do this. I mean, the second term, I think she was just coming into her own, really being able to kind of take advantage of going on these trips to different countries and being able to do these things. And so I think for her, I think part of the reason she was so popular with so many women of her age is that she kind of embodied their feelings of, but this is what we were always supposed to do, and this is good, and it's valid that I do this. But on the other hand, there's so many things everybody else is doing, and I want to be able to do that. And I think that her being able to navigate that, I think, was very important.
I know that on two of the most controversial issues facing women at the time, which have been addressed here before, that she was asked during the 72 campaign press conference when she was on the campaign trail, her feelings about the Equal Rights Amendment, which she supported, and the pending decision, Roe versus Wade, in which she very gently said she believed it was a woman's individual right to that kind of a decision. So she didn't really weigh in personally on that. But you bring up a really important point that I don't believe anyone's ever addressed. And that is, what do we all think Mrs. Nixon, had she had the full second term, if she had had those remaining 3 years, if the president hadn't resigned? I know that's a difficult question, because then the idea of Watergate overhanging it, what would have happened with him, is obviously going to affect her directly. But in terms of her achievements and her interests, I'm hoping all four of you could weigh in and talk a little bit about that.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, we can go down the line. It's a difficult question because, it's always tough for historians to deal in counterfactuals and thinking about these things that may have been. But certainly, I think we would see the continuity of Mrs. Nixon pursuing her passions and the things that she felt fueled her and made her happiest. And so I think we certainly would have seen more of these diplomatic trips being a really important centerpiece of the work that she's doing, especially as American international affairs grow increasingly important in this period. But then on the other hand, there are things that I think she really successfully completed. Going back to Bob's discussion of the White House collection, it's so funny to think about the first ladies that followed her had very little to do with anything related to White House preservation because it had simply been done. So you don't see people like Nancy Reagan and Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Ford really have much to do on that task. So while I think it's true that she could have pursued more of these other tasks that we see in the future, she certainly had some projects that have a nice bow on them at the end of her time at the White House.
I think, too, it's been mentioned here before, two words: get involved. Get involved and get your children involved. It's really sad in this day and age. I don't know in other states, but I know here in California, they don't teach geography in school. So when you say, I'm from Venezuela, to somebody, they have, no, where is Venezuela? So get involved in, whatever you can get involved with to make this country a better place. I think that would be really something that she would carry on. And the volunteers, how many in this room are volunteers? You are the backbone. You are the backbone of this country. Without you, at the Nixon Library, there are just volunteers who have had 4,000 hours. It's just incredible. So I think she would continue with volunteerism, and she would continue with get involved. Don't just sit and let somebody else do it. It's been mentioned here before, too, that indeed one person can make a difference. So I think that would be it.
So I think as Sarah said, it's a very tricky thing, because I actually think part of the reason she got as much space to do what she did was because what was going on with Watergate. She might not have had that space. I'm not sure. I don't know. So on the one hand, I think the lesson is that she was able to kind of take advantage and find these areas and make her mark. Because I think that, I don't know if she would have had those opportunities otherwise, which is, as Sarah said, the dangers of counterfactuals. Sorry to be a bummer. I'm sorry.
Bob?
Well, I'll make sure we don't end on a bummer. I think that one of the things I think about is that, if President Nixon had served his full second term, he would have presided over the country's celebrations of our bicentennial in 1976. And the way she, promoted volunteerism, but just got out in the kind of, she would have had a ball, I think, during the bicentennial. And those of us who can remember back to that, remember the great spirit of unity and proudness, or sense of pride in our country. And just volunteering was going on all over the place as part of those celebrations. So I think that, if they had fit, and that would have been their last full year in the White House, I think she would have just had an absolute grand time helping to lead the celebration of the bicentennial of our country. And it would have given her the opportunity, I think, to really take to new heights what she had been doing in terms of volunteerism and getting out, meeting with people, and just celebrating the idea of this great country of ours.
We have just about 1 minute left, and I have one last question following up on this. I always remember a conversation I had with one of the first directors here, John Taylor, who knew Mrs. Nixon. It was about how much interest she had in what was then about to become the Nixon Presidential Library and Museum, and how she just had a limited idea on, feedback, I should say, on what she wanted to be said about her. And I'm thinking about how her legacy was truncated because of the sudden, just like the Kennedy assassination, the resignation was a shock. And suddenly, her life was, and the White House was over. And I've often wondered why she never thought about writing a memoir, although, of course, by having her daughter write it, she helped, but it still wasn't in her own voice. I'm wondering if you could all weigh in before we're a little bit over by a minute, but I just wonder if you might also muse on why she didn't write her memoirs.
I think one thing that I'll just say in researching Mrs. Nixon is her sense of privacy and the things that she did and did not want shared with the public. And I think that one of the key pieces of a memoir are those behind the scenes moments with your family, with your husband, that we see make a really good, really juicy First Lady memoir. And it just seems out of character for somebody like Mrs. Nixon.
I completely concur with you, Sarah. I really think that was it. And it was mentioned to you, the fact that her daughter, Julie Nixon Eisenhower, wrote a fantastic book. And if you get a chance, it's Pat Nixon, The Untold Story. And that Pat really helped with so much with Julie. And again, the calling to herself, she just wasn't that kind of person. So I think that her legacy lives through her family. 3 things about Pat Nixon: faith, family, friends. That was it. And love for her country. She did it right. She really did.
I agree completely. I think she was so private she wouldn't have thought to do that. And humble. Pride and humble. Having privacy and being humble, she wouldn't have thought that she needed to do that.
It's so interesting you say that, too. I always think about the fact that Americans at the time didn't know that she was a first-generation American, that her mother had been an immigrant from Germany, because so much of her Irish ancestry, her grandparents and great-grandparents had come from Ireland on her father's side. And so we have her birthday tomorrow, and we have St. Patrick's Day the next day, which is when she celebrated it. But people didn't know that she was also, her mother had come from Germany. Bob, would you like to just address the issue of the memoir?
Sure. I'll address it in a slightly different way, Carl. You mentioned when the library was being prepared in 89 to 90, how she really didn't care whether she was in the library very much at all. And I was working in the president's office back in New Jersey, kind of writing the story of his presidency for the library. And we had very little on Mrs. Nixon. And I remember asking John Taylor one time, why isn't there more on Mrs. Nixon? She said, well, her idea was this was the president's library. She didn't really care. Well, I remember after the opening, which my wife and I were at, and as well as I think 50,000 other people, feedback started to come back very quickly after that, back to the president's office back in Woodcliff Lake, New Jersey. There's not enough Pat Nixon in here. And indeed, there was not. So very quickly, in short order, the Pat Nixon part of the library was expanded, still probably not big enough. And, even now it still has, some good stuff on Mrs. Nixon, but I think there could be a little bit more because of just what a huge role she played in President Nixon's entire career, going all the way back to 1946. So, but yeah, it was very funny. When that library opened, everybody on her, particularly who was there, who had been on her staff at the White House, was like, where's the Pat Nixon stuff? So in short order, more Pat Nixon was put into the exhibits.
Thanks very much. And right before this, we go to the film, which is really going to be a beautiful and emotional and really strong summarization of everything we've learned today. I would also take my hat off to someone like Mrs. Nixon, who has not sought credit, but who had, as a woman, a very public role in her father's presidency, and that's Julie Nixon Eisenhower. There was at one point when, while her husband David was active in the Navy, that Julie became very active in the administration, and as did both daughters, and there's recordings, for example, of Tricia Nixon reporting back to her father and Julie reporting back to her father on public events they went to and what the reaction was. But Julie also went out on her own and promoted the environmental policies that we heard earlier about today. And she's never been given credit for that. Much like her mother, I think the importance was that the message get out rather than the messenger being applauded for doing it. But it's a point that has been overlooked, and I just wanted to mention that. So thanks very much, and now we will watch this beautiful, wonderful film.
To be just a small part of this convention that's going to nominate Richard Nixon for another 4 years in the White House. With our gracious and lovely First Lady, Pat Nixon, by his side.
She is one of the most intriguing figures in American history, an accomplished and effective diplomat, an ideal and an inspiration.
I give you the First Lady of our land, the First Lady of our world, Patricia Ryan Nixon.
I think you were in high school, your mother died rather early, and then you had to take care of your father, and you were on your own. Did you kind of take care of the family?
I did. But it was a pleasure because we all worked together.
She rose from the humblest and harshest of beginnings to be voted one of the most admired women in the world for 22 years. She said, "People are my project," and she moved easily and eagerly among people who sensed her strength and felt her compassion. She reshaped and expanded the roles of both the Second and First Lady.
Mrs. Nixon was personally active, visiting hospitals and other institutions.
Mrs. Nixon enjoyed the park herself, even to the point of rolling in a few putts.
Pat Nixon truly experienced, embodied, and exemplified the American dream. Her story began in a cabin in the Copper Hills of Nevada, late on the night before St. Patrick's Day, March 16, 1912. She lost both her parents by 18 and went to work to pay the bills and keep her two brothers in school. She never let her hardships limit or define her. Independent and adventurous, in 1932, she answered an ad to drive an elderly couple across the country. They were surprised that Pat Ryan was a girl, but she got the job. She stayed in New York and took a radiology course at Columbia University. Returning to California, she enrolled at the University of Southern California.
While you were in high school, did you decide what you wanted to do when you went to college, what you wanted to become?
I hadn't decided exactly, except that I knew I wanted an education. I didn't want to marry early or try to go up without the education which I felt was necessary.
To pay for her schooling, she found work in a Los Angeles department store and as an extra in Hollywood films.
And I was offered part, but I decided not to drop out of school.
And in 1937, when only 1 in 10 women earned a 4-year degree, Pat Ryan graduated cum laude and with the equivalent of a master's degree. After graduation, she taught at Whittier High School, where she met a young lawyer named Richard Nixon. After World War II, the young couple settled down and began a family. Tricia was born in 1946, and Julie in 1948. When Dick ran for Congress from California's 12th district, Pat was an equal part and partner in the campaign, and the formidable Nixon team was forged. On their many travels, she excelled as an ambassador on behalf of the American people. She traveled to 81 countries and every state in the Union, sharing her genuine warmth, indomitable spirit, and her compassionate strength. She broke new ground as Second Lady. Wherever she went, she insisted that her schedule include meetings with real people in real places. Schools, orphanages, hospitals, village markets. In Panama, she even visited a leper colony.
Mrs. Nixon visited the Palo Seco Leprosarium, where she toured under the personal guidance of its director.
She continued this custom as First Lady. In 1970, she brought relief supplies to the devastated country of Peru.
It is a signal honor for me to receive this decoration from the government of Peru. I accept it for the people of the United States who are glad to lend a helping hand to their neighbors in distress.
Pat Nixon repeatedly broke the mold. She was the first First Lady to travel to Africa. There, and in South America, she became the first First Lady to serve as an official representative of the United States as she met the people and conferred with their leaders. She was the first First Lady to address another nation's parliament and the first to enter an active combat zone.
Mrs. Nixon took a helicopter ride 15 minutes out of Saigon to a war orphanage at Two Duck. On the ground, there were jeep loads of soldiers who rode shotgun cover for her. She brushed aside official briefings so she could have more time to see the troops.
When the President and First Lady visited China, millions around the world saw that remote and isolated communist country for the first time through Pat Nixon's eyes. Her attention to detail and respect for cultural tradition was noted and appreciated. From mastering basic Chinese phrases to choosing her now iconic red coat, signifying good luck and happiness. She was personally responsible for the Chinese gesture that captured the imagination of America, the gift of 2 giant pandas to the National Zoo in Washington. Closer to home, Pat Nixon actively encouraged women to run for public office. She supported the Equal Rights Amendment, lobbied her husband to appoint a woman to the Supreme Court, and was the first First Lady to wear pants in public. Pat Nixon truly made the White House the people's house. She was responsible for its being lighted at night, a tradition that continues to this day. She initiated rose garden tours and candlelight Christmas tours, and, as part of the extensive White House renovations, which she oversaw,
Good afternoon and welcome to the beautiful new Blue Room of the White House.
Installed wheelchair ramps, pioneered special tours for the blind, and acquired more than 600 historic paintings, antiques, and furnishings, more than any First Lady before or since. She was the most public of figures, but she was intensely private, and only a lucky few knew her fun-loving spirit and her sly sense of humor.
Yes, I do, from time to time, have a good laugh over the fact that I'm supposed to be shy.
Her later years afforded Pat Nixon what she truly desired most, time with her family, including her 4 grandchildren, Jenny, Alex, Melanie, and Christopher. She passed away, surrounded by her family, in June of 1993. Pat Nixon was as accomplished as she was modest, as strong as she was warm. Although she spent nearly 50 years in the public eye, she never sought the attention that came with her positions or activities. Even if people didn't know her, they knew that they admired her.
Mrs. Nixon should not be underestimated.
When you think of Pat, her husband of 53 years said, I hope that you remember the sunshine of her smile. She would like that.
Hello. As we close our event today, I just wanted to note that that video was narrated by Jenny Eisenhower, who is the daughter of Julie, and we really appreciate her for doing that. This was such a wonderful program today. I'd like to give everyone a round of applause again for their great contributions, so thank you. We want to extend a special thank you to all of our panelists and moderators for being here today, and we appreciate the knowledge and understanding that we gained from each of you through the lens of women's history in the Nixon administration. We also wanted to extend a special thank you to our partners, the Richard Nixon Foundation, and for all of their great work and help in putting this event together. We also want to thank the Nixon Docent Guild, the dedicated staff of the Nixon Library, the National Archives team, the White House Historical Association, and our friends at C-SPAN for your tremendous support of today's event. We invite you to join us here at the Nixon Library tomorrow for Pat Nixon's birthday and a celebration of service. You can enjoy free admission all day long and activities throughout the day. We also invite you to join us for our second Tuesday's book talks and the many other events that the Nixon Foundation as well as National Archives puts on here. You can learn more by visiting our websites at nixonlibrary.gov or nixonfoundation.org. We also want to invite you, if you have some time today, to stop by out there and visit our women's history display and education case. And we're also playing a video about women's history that you can watch in Theater 37. So thank you again for all of you for joining us today, and we really appreciate you. Thank you. Oh, and I did want to note for the panelists, if you could please join us up here on stage. We're going to take a quick picture. Thank you.